He was ashamed of his wife and left her at home to go out with a lover, but no one expected her to turn things around. Daniel stood before the full-length mirror in his luxurious walk-in closet. He examined his image with meticulous attention, as if scrutinizing the print on a suit freshly tailored. He liked what he saw. The man reflected before him was a successful businessman, a millionaire, respected in the world of top investors, and desired by the most sought-after women in high society. Every detail of his appearance had been meticulously crafted to impress. His hair always impeccably styled, the Swiss watch gleaming on his wrist, the sophisticated fragrance that exuded power and exclusivity. But despite the perfection of his exterior, something still didn't align with the new identity he had created for himself. Something stood out, pulling him backward. Sophia. She was a part of a past he was trying to distance himself from. She had been by his side during the hard times, when Daniel was still a young, ambitious man trying to find his place in the business world. In the early years of their marriage, she had been his greatest supporter, his confidant, his partner. But now, Sophia represented everything he wanted to leave behind. He remembered the days when they lived in a small apartment, counting every penny to pay the bills at the end of the month. Sophia cooked the same simple meals every night, washed the dishes with a tired but contented smile. At that time, it made him feel welcomed. But today, he saw no allure in that kind of life. He wanted refinement. He wanted sophistication. He wanted a woman who reflected the power and influence he had finally acquired. Sophia was not that woman. While Daniel circulated through gala dinners and exclusive events where the country's most important names gathered to seal million-dollar deals, Sophia stayed at home, invisible to the world. She had never liked parties, exposure, never knew how to dress to impress or talk about investments like the women he admired. Over the years, Sophia had become just a discrete detail in his life. Someone who waited for him at the end of the day, but who had no prominent place beside him. So that evening, when Daniel mentioned the gala event, he already knew the answer before even asking. "There's an important reception tomorrow," he said casually, adjusting the cufflinks on his shirt. "Would you like to go with me?" Sophia looked up from the book she was reading on the sofa. From the way he spoke, it didn't seem like a real invitation. A reception? What kind of event? A meeting of businessmen and investors, a gala night. He watched her expression, waiting for the reaction he knew would come. Sophia hesitated for a moment. "I don't think I have the right clothes for that kind of occasion," she murmured, almost embarrassed. Daniel smiled with contained satisfaction. Exactly what he expected. "If you don't feel comfortable, that's fine," he said, feigning understanding. "It's quite an exclusive event, high society, you know." He didn't even need to finish the sentence. Sophia slowly closed the book, ran her fingers over the cover and nodded. "I think it's better if you go alone then." Daniel felt an immediate sense of relief. It was settled. He wouldn't have to bring her to an environment where, without a doubt, she would feel out of place, where her simplicity and shyness would clash with the dazzling, confident women who thrived in such settings. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and unlocked the screen. There was a message waiting for him. "Confirmed for tomorrow. I can't wait to spend the evening with you." Natalie. She, yes, was the kind of woman he needed. Born wealthy, always dressed in exclusive haute couture, always surrounded by influential people. Natalie didn't need explanations about the elite world. She was part of it. She navigated sophisticated events as if at home, knew every major businessman by name, and understood precisely how to impress the right people. Daniel smiled slightly. Natalie would be the perfect companion for that evening. However, he needed to wrap things up with Sophia properly. "You know, love," he said, adopting a casual tone as he slipped his phone into his pocket. Maybe it's better if you don't go after all. These events are quite sophisticated. They require a certain level of preparation. It could be tiring for you." He expected Sophia to accept his words without question, and that's exactly what she did. "I understand." Daniel waited for something more. A question, a sign of resentment, hesitation. But she simply opened her book again and resumed reading, as if the conversation had already ended. For some reason, that bothered him. The next day, when Sophia woke up, Daniel had already left. She found a cold cup of coffee on the table and a quick note beside it. "Don't wait up." She stared at the words for a moment, then took the note and ripped it in half. The silence of the room felt heavier than ever. Sophia sat at the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the soft rug, hands resting on her knees. The apartment was eerily quiet, broken only by the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. Daniel had left again, and as always, without a care for how she might feel. In the beginning, it hurt. Each indifferent word, each dismissive glance, every time he treated her like a disposable accessory. But over time, the pain gave way to quiet acceptance. She had become used to being ignored, treated as invisible in her own home. But now, it was different. That night, for the first time, she felt a different weight in her chest. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't bitterness, it was a silent anger, cold and quiet. A feeling that slowly grew inside her, a quiet revolt that made her question everything. What if I don't accept this anymore? The thought struck her like a jolt. Sophia blinked a few times, surprised at herself. She had never allowed herself to think that way. For years, she had lived believing that her duty was to support Daniel, help him grow, be the perfect wife who stayed in the background while he shone. But what about her? Who was there for her? Who made her feel valued? The painful answer was no one. A tightness in her chest crept in, but this time she didn't let the anxiety consume her. She took a deep breath and stood up from the bed, walking to the small office at the end of the hall. That space, once her refuge, had been forgotten, gathering dust and memories of a time when she still believed in herself. She opened the drawer and began rifling through old papers. Bills, notes, documents of no importance, until her eyes fell upon a crumpled sheet of paper, forgotten among the rest. She grabbed it curiously and saw that it was an email. At first, she read it absent-mindedly, but as the words began to make sense, something inside her stirred. It was an invitation to a conference about digital business. She reread the email twice, feeling a strange flutter in her stomach. The conference would bring together specialists in technology, investors, and entrepreneurs in search of innovation. The kind of event that years ago would have made her eyes sparkle. Before she was just Daniel's wife, Sophia had dreams. She had always been strategic, with ambitious ideas. But all that had been pushed aside when she chose to support her husband, abandoning her own aspirations. But now, as she looked at that screen, she remembered the woman she used to be. Maybe this was her chance. Sophia leaned back in the chair, her eyes fixed on the screen. All along, she had believed her only role was to be Daniel's shadow. But now, he was clearly moving away from her, seeking another woman who could embody his new world. And if he could move on, why couldn't she do the same? The thought was scary, but at the same time, it was liberating. For the first time, she realized she didn't need Daniel's approval to be someone. That night, when Daniel appeared in the living room ready for the gala, Sophia watched him from the armchair where she sat. He wore a flawless suit, his hair meticulously combed back, his expensive cologne filling the room. "Are you going?" she asked, her voice lacking emotion. He didn't even look at her as he adjusted the cuff of his shirt. Yes. That was it. No explanation, no details, no invitation, even if false. She waited for some consideration, some trace of respect, but Daniel just grabbed his wallet, his phone, and walked out the door. "Aren't you going to tell me where you're going?" Sophia tried once more, not because she still cared, but because she wanted to see just how far he would go. He hesitated for a brief moment before opening the door and walking out without answering. The door closed behind him, and with it came a certainty. Sophia stared at the empty space for a few seconds, feeling a strange calm. No tears, no desperation, just a deep and final silence. Maybe this was the last time she would allow herself to be left behind. She turned and walked to the laptop, sat on the couch and opened a new tab. She created an account on a business platform, typing her details with precision. Each click was a step into the unknown. But this time, she wasn't afraid. That night, she didn't cry. She planned. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. The cursor blinked on the illuminated screen of the laptop, casting a soft glow over Sophia's face. The apartment was quiet, the only sound being the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. Daniel still hadn't returned, and for the first time, she didn't care. With her eyes glued to the screen, Sophia typed digital entrepreneurship into the search bar. With each click, a new world opened up before her. Business models, success stories, growth strategies. Her heart raced as she navigated through articles and videos. It felt like she was waking up from a long sleep. The words financial independence, exponential growth, and scalable opportunities stood out among the texts. Until now, these concepts had only belonged to Daniel's world. But that night, she realized she didn't need him to understand them. She could learn on her own. She devoured everything with a hunger she hadn't felt in years. She discovered how small businesses were using the internet to sell products without needing physical stores. How women from different parts of the world were building million-dollar businesses from scratch. How a well-structured idea could become an empire. And then, like a flash, she remembered a project she had started years ago, back when she still believed in her own dreams. Before she became just Daniel's shadow, Sophia had outlined a plan for a digital platform featuring handcrafted products made by women entrepreneurs. She had seen how many talented women were stuck in informality because they lacked structure and visibility. She wanted to change that, create a space where they could sell, expand, and gain financial independence. But years had passed, and the idea had been forgotten, swallowed by the responsibilities of marriage and the demands of being the perfect wife. Now, she saw everything clearly. The internet had changed the world, and her project, which once seemed distant, was more viable than ever. But as she got excited about the possibilities, a discreet fear began to creep into her mind. What if it was too late? Sophia closed her eyes and sighed. She had been out of the market for years. All this time, she had limited herself to being just the wife of a successful businessman. Could she really start from scratch? Would anyone take her seriously? What if she failed? She swallowed hard. There was still a part of her carrying that insecurity, still hearing Daniel's voice echoing in her mind. This kind of thing isn't for you. But what if it was? She bit her lip and opened her contact list. She scrolled through the names one by one until one caught her attention. Rebecca. They had been friends in college. Back then, Rebecca was obsessed with technology, while Sophia focused on market strategies. Together, they had big dreams. But while Sophia gave up everything for Daniel, Rebecca pursued her own journey. Now, she was a specialist in digital platform development. Sophia hesitated for a moment before typing a short, direct message. Rebecca, long time no talk, but I have a project in mind, and I think you can help me. Can we chat? The message was sent. She didn't expect an immediate response. But to her surprise, her phone vibrated just a few minutes later. "Isa, long time. Tell me, what do you have in mind?" Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath and started typing, trying to condense years of ideas into a few sentences. She explained her vision for the platform, how she imagined it working, the impact it could have. The response came quickly. "Your project is amazing. Let's work on this together." She let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't alone. But there was another obstacle. To take the first steps, she needed investment. Nothing grand, just enough to register the company, buy a domain, and hire designers. The problem? She didn't have her own money. All the assets were tied to Daniel, except for one thing. Sophia stood up and walked to the closet. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small blue velvet box. Inside rested a diamond necklace, one of the first luxurious gifts Daniel had given her years ago. At the time, he had said it was a symbol of how important she was to him. Now it was just an object without sentimental value. She grabbed her phone and searched for jewelers who bought high-value pieces. The next day, she would sell the necklace. Daniel would never notice its absence. The money that once symbolized her submission would now fund her freedom. With one last glance at the laptop, Sophia realized she was on a path with no return. And for the first time, that didn't scare her. The ballroom was a spectacle of luxury and sophistication. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting their golden glow over the meticulously arranged tables, where champagne glasses sparkled beneath the warm light. Daniel moved through the guests with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to behave in this environment. Neatly tied ties, expensive dresses, calculated conversations. He belonged to this world, and by his side Natalie, wearing a red gown that hugged her curves perfectly, was the ideal complement to the image he wanted to project. But for some reason, his mind wasn't fully there. As he smiled and shook hands, Daniel felt a troubling distraction slowly taking over his thoughts. He remembered the moment he had left home that night, how Sophia hadn't even bothered to ask where he was going, how she had simply nodded, without hesitation, without resentment, as if his absence no longer mattered. He had expected feigned indifference, perhaps even a look of reproach. But what he received was something worse, a true silence. Daniel tried to push the uneasy feelings away, focusing on Natalie. But contrary to what he had expected, her presence didn't fill the emptiness inside him. Natalie moved gracefully through the hall, engaging in conversations with other businessmen. She smiled at powerful men, listened to their stories, commented with intelligence and elegance. But Daniel wasn't the center of her attention. He watched her, feeling an unease he couldn't explain. He was used to being admired. Sophia had always been a quiet presence, but he knew she was there for him. Natalie, on the other hand, didn't seem to care. For the first time, Daniel realized she wasn't the woman he had idealized. Yes, she was beautiful. Yes, she belonged to high society, but she wasn't devoted to him. She didn't look at him with admiration, and that bothered him more than he was willing to admit. In the days that followed, something inside him continued to gnaw at him. But it wasn't Natalie. It was Sophia. There was something about her that was different. She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't try to start a conversation. When he came home, he didn't feel her presence waiting for him anymore. Before, she used to try to please him, seeking his attention, asking about his day, trying to make him feel special. Now it seemed like she simply didn't care. At first, Daniel thought it was just a phase, but as the days went by, he realized that the routine at home had shifted in a subtle but definitive way. Sophia wasn't there for him as she used to be, and that bothered him. Curiosity began to grow. He had never needed to worry about Sophia. She had always been predictable. She had always been within reach, waiting for him, ready to cater to his needs. But something had changed, and Daniel hated not knowing what it was. That's why one night, while Sophia was sleeping, he quietly walked to her office. He opened the laptop and accessed her browsing history. What he found left him unsettled. Sophia had been researching startups, reading articles on digital entrepreneurship, watching videos about investments. There were email exchanges with experts in the field and, most surprisingly of all, a registration for a new company in her name. Daniel leaned back in the chair, a strange irritation taking over him. What was Sophia trying to do? She had always been his wife, his partner, the one who stayed at home while he shone in the business world. But now she was trying to become something more. He closed the laptop, unsure of how to react. The next night, he decided to test her. "I have an important event tomorrow," he said, as he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror. "Are you staying home?" He expected anything. A question, a hesitation, perhaps even a comment about Natalie. But Sophia just looked up, smiled faintly, and replied, "Have fun." Daniel fell silent for a moment, unsure why, but feeling a strange discomfort spreading through his chest. He left without saying anything else, but for the first time, he felt like he no longer had control. The coffee sat forgotten in the cup beside her laptop, growing cold while Sophia kept her eyes fixed on the screen. The mouse pointer hovered over the launch button. Weeks of intense work had led up to this moment. Every line of code, every design tweak, every conversation with Rebecca had brought her here. She took a deep breath and clicked. For a moment, nothing happened. Sophia knew that this was how things worked. Success didn't come instantly, and she wasn't expecting a rush of visitors right away. But even so, her heart raced. She opened the Stats tab and watched in real time as the first visitors began to arrive. 1, 2, 5 entrepreneurs signing up. Small businesses selling handcrafted goods, sustainable fashion, handmade jewelry, and then the first order. It was small, a set of aromatic candles, but to Sophia it felt like a symbol. The beginning of something that had once existed only in her mind and was now real. Her phone buzzed. "Rebecca, can you see this? We're already getting orders." Sophia smiled. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this rush of excitement. For years, her life had been predictable, monotonous, bound to the role of Daniel's wife. But now, for the first time, she felt alive. The next morning, as she sipped her coffee, her phone exploded with notifications. Something had happened. She opened her apps and saw that a social media influencer had posted a mention of her platform. A simple photo, a short video praising the website's concept and encouraging her followers to buy from the featured entrepreneurs. The numbers skyrocketed. Orders started pouring in. Small businesses that used to sell one item a week were now selling out their stock within hours. Sophia watched, wide-eyed, almost in disbelief. She picked up the phone and called Rebecca. "Are you seeing this?" she said, her voice filled with excitement. "This is just the beginning, Issa," Rebecca replied. "We need to think big." Think big. The words echoed in Sophia's mind throughout the day. It was then that Rebecca made a suggestion that would change everything. "We need investors." Sophia paused for a moment. "Investors?" "Yes, with more capital, we can expand quickly. Add more features to the platform, invest in marketing, really grow. If we keep going like this, we'll hit a limit soon." The idea made sense. But Sophia knew what bringing investors in meant. It meant truly stepping into the world of business, becoming an entrepreneur in the most expansive sense of the word. And it meant Daniel would eventually find out. She turned her gaze to the side, feeling a knot in her stomach. For so many years, Daniel had been the only reference of success she had. He spoke of business with such authority that she came to believe she could never compete in that world. But now, with the numbers growing before her eyes, Sophia realized she didn't need to compete with him. She just needed to follow her own path. "All right," she said after a moment. "Let's go after investors." A few days later, Sophia received an unexpected invitation. A startup conference was gathering some of the top investors in the industry, and her platform was catching their attention. Rebecca had managed to sign them up as participants. It was a unique opportunity, but Sophia hesitated, not because she doubted the potential of the business, but because in the past she had been to events like that. Back then, her only role was to accompany Daniel, smile by his side, be introduced as my wife, and listen to conversations that he never thought were of any interest to her. Now, it would be different. She wasn't going as anyone's wife. She was going as a businesswoman. The night before the event, Sophia opened her closet. She looked at the clothes neatly hung on the racks, the discreet dresses she used to wear, always chosen to avoid drawing attention. Daniel liked it that way, but this time she wanted to be noticed. She chose an elegant yet different dress, bolder, with strategic cuts that emphasized her presence. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she no longer saw the faded woman who had spent years living in the shadow of an indifferent husband. She saw someone reborn, and she liked what she saw. The luxury hotel ballroom was filled with powerful figures from the business world. Daniel moved through the guests with ease, accustomed to this environment. The event was one of the most important in the sector, bringing together investors and promising entrepreneurs in search of strategic partnerships. For him, it was just another night to reaffirm his position and secure valuable new contacts. He was about to approach a group of executives when something caught his attention. Across the room, among a small circle of investors, was Sophia. For a moment, Daniel thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, it was really her. Her posture was confident, her smile natural, and the way others listened to her made it clear she was not just another accessory at a business event. She wasn't the Sophia he knew. Daniel felt a strange pang in his chest. Sophia had always been discreet, reserved, someone who stayed on the sidelines while he shone. But now, here she was, in an impeccable dress, conversing fluidly, being heard with interest by men he respected in the market. Without realizing it, Daniel furrowed his brow. She had never mentioned anything about being involved in this world. What was going on? He decided to approach. When Sophia saw him, there was a brief moment of tension in her eyes. But contrary to what Daniel expected, there was no nervousness. There was no hesitation. Just a calm, serene light in her eyes, something that unsettled him deeply. "Sophia," he said, offering a smile that tried to mask his discomfort. "Daniel." There was an exchange of glances that seemed to last longer than it should have. A silent confrontation. Daniel was waiting to see the usual submission, the familiar reflection of someone still seeking his approval. But there was none of that. And that bothered him. The circle around Sophia began to disperse as the conversation between them became inevitable. Daniel crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes. "What are you doing here?" She tilted her head slightly, as if her presence there was the most natural thing in the world. "Building something of my own." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Something inside him twisted. Before he could say anything else, one of the investors Sophia had been talking to approached. It was a well-known name in the market, someone Daniel respected. "Sophia, I have to say, your idea has incredible potential. We'd like to talk more about investments," he said. Daniel felt his blood boil. Sophia's company? Investors? Recognition? Since when had she become someone who attracted this kind of attention? He forced a smile, but his fingers clenched involuntarily at the sleeve of his suit. "I didn't know you were involved in this sector," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. "I imagine you didn't," Sophia replied, her smile almost imperceptible. She didn't say anything else. She didn't explain, didn't justify herself. She didn't try to prove anything to him, and that was what bothered him the most. That night, Daniel tried to push away the strange feeling that had followed him since the event. He told himself it was just a passing moment, that Sophia wouldn't be able to keep this up for long. But deep down, an uncomfortable truth began to settle within him. He had underestimated Sophia, and now it might be too late to go back. The apartment, once a quiet refuge, had become a silent battleground. Daniel didn't know exactly when things had changed, but he could feel the shift in the air. Before, he would come home and find Sophia always present, carrying out the predictable routine he had come to take for granted. Now, the scene was different. In recent days, Sophia spent less and less time at home. When she was there, she seemed perpetually busy, with her laptop open, talking on the phone, organizing something he didn't fully understand. There was a new energy in her, something Daniel didn't recognize. At first, he tried to ignore it. He thought it was just a temporary distraction, a phase that would pass. But it didn't pass. One evening, he found her sitting on the couch, typing away on the computer. He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "This is just a hobby, right?" he asked with a half-smile of disdain. Sophia stopped typing and looked up at him. For the first time in a long time, her gaze didn't hold submission or even irritation. It was calm. "No," she replied. "It's a growing empire." Her words hit him in a way he hadn't expected. He felt an uncomfortable sensation in his chest, but he tried not to show it. Daniel didn't understand why that bothered him so much. Maybe because, for the first time, Sophia was talking about something that didn't involve him. For the first time, she had an ambition that wasn't linked to his name, to his success, to the world he had built. And worse, she wasn't asking for his opinion. In the following days, Daniel began to notice how much her presence had changed. Before, he was certain that Sophia would always be there, available to attend to his every need. But now, it seemed like she didn't even notice his absence. He saw her rushing through the apartment, talking on the phone, replying to emails, planning something big. "Could you at least stop for a minute?" he said one evening, watching her focus on the screen and not acknowledging that he had entered. Sophia finished typing and closed the laptop slowly, unhurried. "Is something wrong?" "Yes, you're different," he said, his frustration growing. "I'm not different," Sophia replied, calm. "I'm just busy." That was exactly what bothered him. She was busy, with something that wasn't him. Meanwhile, Natalie began to notice the change. Daniel no longer seemed present when they were together. They would go out to events, but he was always distracted, lost in thought. "What's going on with you?" Natalie asked one night as they sat at an upscale restaurant. He lifted his eyes, confused. "What do you mean?" "You're not the same as before," she said, crossing her arms. "You used to be sure of yourself. Now you seem restless." Daniel didn't answer right away. He took a sip of the whiskey in front of him and turned his gaze elsewhere. He knew the answer. He knew that before, his life had been predictable. He knew Sophia had always been there, silently, discreetly, devoted. But now she had changed, and that was throwing him off in a way he didn't want to admit. One evening, when he saw her getting ready to leave, something that rarely happened before, Daniel couldn't ignore it anymore. "You're pulling away," he said, watching her through the bedroom mirror. Sophia turned slowly. "I'm not pulling away," she replied with a calm smile. "I'm finally finding myself." He fell silent. For the first time, Daniel realized that he might be losing something he never imagined he could lose. Daniel opened the door to the apartment and was greeted by a silence unlike anything he had ever experienced there before. For years, this same silence had brought him comfort, the certainty that Sophia would always be waiting for him, discreet, predictable. But now, This silence was heavy, filled with something he couldn't name. He walked slowly into the living room and found Sophia sitting at the glass table. There was a stack of papers in front of her, and her posture was rigid, indicating that this was no ordinary night. Something was about to change, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt an unease he couldn't explain. "What's all this?" he asked, frowning when he saw the documents on the table. Sophia didn't flinch. She didn't show any hesitation or discomfort. She simply pushed the papers toward him, calmly, as if she had already made her decision. Daniel picked up one of the papers and began to read, a chill running down his spine as the words became clear. His eyes flicked back to Sophia, searching for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. "They're divorce papers," she said firmly. He laughed, but the laugh was short and nervous, lacking any real humor. He ran a hand through his hair as if trying to process his thoughts. "Divorce? You must be kidding," he said, expecting her to back down, to say this was just a way of getting his attention. But Sophia simply watched him, serene, unaffected. That only made him angrier. He flipped through the papers, as if looking for something that could prove this was all a mistake. "This doesn't make sense. What's gotten into you?" he demanded, trying to regain control of the situation. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her arms crossed. Her gaze didn't show anger or sadness, just a calm that unsettled Daniel. "What's gotten into me? I finally saw things as they are," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. It sent a shiver of irritation through him. He threw the papers back on the table and laughed again, this time with a mocking tone. "You're overreacting. You're confused. I know you've been busy with whatever this project of yours is, but that doesn't mean you need to make such a drastic decision," he said, convinced that this was just an impulsive move on her part. What he didn't expect was the response that followed. "My project is already worth more than half of your emerging companies, Daniel," she said, and for the first time, he saw a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. Daniel blinked, a knot forming in his throat. "You're kidding," he murmured, but Sophia just smiled to the side. "Am I?" she asked, her tone challenging. That was a blow to his ego. Suddenly, he realized he had never truly understood her potential. While he had been focused on himself, building his empire, she had been quietly amassing something of her own, something real. "We've had a history together, Sophia. Are you really going to throw all of that away?" he asked, trying to hold on to whatever was left of their connection. She sighed, as though listening to an argument she had already heard 100 times. "You left me behind a long time ago, Daniel. I'm just following your example," she said, and he felt a sharp sting of guilt mixed with frustration. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in years, he was speechless in front of her. "You don't have to do this," he insisted, though it was clear his voice was losing its power. "We can try again. We can fix things," he said, desperately searching for a way to salvage their marriage. Sophia tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was a curious look in her eyes, like she was observing a man she no longer recognized. "You didn't choose me when you had the chance, Daniel. Now I'm the one who doesn't choose you," she said, and her words felt like a final verdict. The weight of those words hit him like a physical blow. He had always thought Sophia would be there, no matter what. He had always believed that she would wait for him, that he could control everything, even their marriage. But now she was walking away from him without hesitation. She was leaving, and he couldn't stop her. For the first time, Daniel felt fear. In the following days, he oscillated between anger and denial. He couldn't accept that this was really happening. Sophia had always been predictable, always there. How could she decide to leave him just like that? He tried to convince himself that it was just a passing whim, something that would blow over. But when the divorce papers arrived on his desk signed, he understood that there was no going back. Sophia wasn't just threatening him, she had really left. The divorce came quickly, almost coldly. No fights, no long discussions, no emotional games like he was used to seeing in separations. Sophia simply walked out of his life as if she had been planning it for a long time. And maybe she had. The day she left the apartment for good, Daniel stood in the living room, staring at the few boxes she had taken with her. There were so few. He realized then just how little she had actually left behind. Sophia had lived by his side for years, but she hadn't left much for him to hold on to. When the door closed behind her, loneliness settled in like an old friend. Daniel had never liked to admit it, but there was comfort in knowing Sophia would always be there. Now, she was gone. He looked around, and for the first time in years, he realized that he was truly alone. He collapsed on the couch and rubbed his face with his hands, feeling a weight he couldn't name. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of the certainty he had always had, that Sophia would never leave him. The next day, he picked up the phone without thinking. His fingers hovered over her name in his contacts. For a moment, he considered calling her, saying something, trying to reverse this. But what could he say? That he missed her, that he regretted it, that he couldn't live without the security of having her waiting for him. He felt anger rise at even considering the idea. With a heavy sigh, he threw the phone on the table and stood up. He wouldn't call her. His pride wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, Sophia was walking to the elevator, not looking back. As the doors closed, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of submission finally lift. She was no longer Daniel's wife. She was Sophia, independent, powerful, and for the first time that was all that mattered. She smiled to herself as she left the building, feeling the cool night wind touch her skin. The world outside was waiting for her, and this time she wasn't afraid. The event hall in London was packed. Journalists, investors, and businessmen jostled for space to see the biggest names in digital innovation. Sophia walked down the main aisle with impeccable posture, her eyes focused without a trace of hesitation. She had grown accustomed to the respectful and admiring glances. She moved through the giants of the industry, no longer as an observer, but as one of the leaders of this world. Her name, once unknown, was now among the most influential in the market. The platform Sophia had created had gone global. What started as a modest project had become a digital revolution. Small entrepreneurs from all corners of the world now had access to international customers, easily selling their products and gaining recognition. Banks, investment funds, and large corporations began vying for partnerships with her company. Sophia hadn't just created an innovative business model, she had redefined e-commerce for women. Her brand had become a global reference. Major news outlets began highlighting her journey. The woman who turned a dream into an empire. One headline read, "From forgotten wife to digital magnate," proclaimed another. Sophia had become a symbol of empowerment. Each lecture she gave, each interview she granted, served as an inspiration to others. Aspiring businesswomen saw her as living proof that they didn't need to live in anyone's shadow. For the first time in her life, Sophia was celebrated, not for who she was with, but for what she had built on her own. Her routine had completely transformed. Sophia traveled constantly for strategic meetings and international conferences. She woke early, spent her days negotiating and planning, and attended exclusive events at night. She was no longer the woman waiting at home, ignored by her husband. Now she sat at the table with the most powerful people and was listened to attentively. And most importantly, she did all of this because she wanted to, because she loved what she was building. For the first time, she felt truly free. During an innovation event in Paris, Sophia received a special invitation to an exclusive dinner. Only the top investors in the industry would be present. She was used to meetings like this, but something about this particular event would change the course of her evening. Among the guests, one name caught her attention: Samuel, a man who had always believed in her long before anyone else. When their eyes met, Samuel smiled genuinely. He walked toward her slowly, as though their meeting was inevitable. "Sophia, what a pleasant surprise," he said, his voice warm with respect and admiration. She smiled back, feeling a familiar connection. "Samuel, good to see you again. I should have known you'd be here," she responded, accepting the champagne glass the waiter handed her. The conversation flowed effortlessly between them. Samuel asked about the growth of her company, the challenges of international expansion, and what her next steps were. But there was something more than business in the air. Sophia realized that, unlike Daniel, Samuel saw her as an equal. Not as a woman who needed someone to guide her, but as a leader, just as capable as anyone else in that room. And that touched her in a way she hadn't expected. Samuel had always been an investor with vision, but more than that, he had always seen Sophia's potential. Even when she was just Daniel's wife, he had recognized what she was capable of. And now, standing before her, he had the confirmation that he had been right all along. "I always knew you'd go far," he said, raising his glass. Sophia smiled subtly, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: a true connection. The following months brought even more growth. Sophia's company secured strategic partnerships that expanded her presence in emerging markets. With investors from all over the world, the platform grew exponentially. Now, her fortune wasn't just solid. It had turned her into a multimillionaire. The numbers spoke for themselves, but for Sophia, the most important thing was knowing that she had built all of this without relying on anyone. Daniel, the man who had once believed she would never have the strength to move forward without him, had become nothing more than a distant shadow. The past no longer mattered. What she had lived through with him seemed like another life, another time, a reality that no longer had a place in her world. Daniel was no longer a name that brought her pain or resentment. He had simply become irrelevant. One evening, while reviewing contracts in her luxurious apartment in Milan, Sophia received an unexpected message. It was an invitation to be featured on the cover of one of the world's most prestigious business magazines. The article would cover her journey, her impact on the digital market, and her meteoric rise. Sophia read the invitation and smiled. Years ago, she never would have imagined her name alongside the greatest leaders of the current age. But now, here she was. Gala events, strategic meetings, and interviews had become part of her routine. At one of these events, a journalist asked her, "If you could go back in time and tell the Sophia from a few years ago something, what would you say?" Sophia paused for a moment before responding. "I would tell her not to doubt herself, to never dim her light for anyone." Her response went viral on social media. Sophia became a symbol of empowerment, and her influence reached far beyond business. Women from around the world saw her as a real example that it was possible to start over, that independence wasn't a distant dream, but a choice. And that was her greatest achievement. Samuel, who had been closely following her success, didn't hide his admiration. "You didn't just build an empire, Sophia. You changed the lives of many," he said one evening at a dinner in Barcelona. Sophia smiled, feeling truly fulfilled. "And to think I once believed my destiny was to stay in someone's shadow," she replied, raising her glass. While Sophia celebrated her rise, Daniel was facing a completely different reality. The man who once had been arrogant and self-assured now lived surrounded by the emptiness of his own choices. None of the women he had tried to get involved with gave him what Sophia had once given him: true loyalty. The success he had chased so desperately didn't fill the void left by the woman he had never valued. One afternoon, while flipping through a business magazine, Daniel saw Sophia's photo on the cover. The headline read, "The Woman Who Conquered the World on Her Own." He read the article and for the first time felt the weight of what he had lost. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that he didn't care. But deep down, he knew he would never find another like her. In the height of her empire, Sophia no longer thought of him. There was no room for resentment, nor for memories of the past. Her life now was about the future, about growth, about freedom. As she looked out the window of her office, watching the bustling city below, she smiled. She was exactly where she was meant to be, and for the first time, she was certain she would never look back. Daniel entered his luxurious penthouse and was met with an uncomfortable silence. He threw his keys onto the marble table, loosened his tie, and poured himself a whiskey. For years, he had believed that success would bring complete satisfaction, that money and status would be enough. But that night, as he looked around, he realized that all of it felt empty. He had conquered every goal, but paradoxically, nothing seemed to have any real meaning. The parties, once filled with glamour, now felt like repetitive events without purpose. He conversed with the same people, drank the same expensive wines, surrounded himself with stunning women who laughed at his jokes without really listening to him. But for some reason, he could no longer enjoy it. He felt displaced in his own life, like a spectator watching himself in a play without a script. Nothing had color, nothing had life. Sophia had never been the center of his world, but her absence had become impossible to ignore. At first, he hadn't noticed the impact. He thought he could just continue as he always had, that his routine would remain unchanged. But as the days passed, every detail of the house seemed to remind him that she was no longer there. Small things, the coffee cup she always left in the sink, the books on the table, the faint scent of her perfume in the hallway, had disappeared. He found himself aimlessly walking around the apartment, as though looking for something without knowing what it was. He missed having someone waiting for him, someone whose eyes would notice him, even on the days when he said nothing. Sophia had always been there, quietly, discreetly, and he had believed that would never change. Now he realized how wrong he had been. One morning, as he drank coffee alone, Daniel picked up the newspaper and froze when he saw a headline that made his heart stop. "The Woman Who Revolutionized the Digital Market," it read, accompanied by a photo of Sophia at a business event. He slammed the cup down on the table and read every word of the article, feeling a growing discomfort inside him. She had built an empire. Her digital platform had become a global phenomenon, attracting international investors and establishing itself as one of the largest in the market. Sophia, the woman he had never seen as a visionary, was now one of the most respected names in the industry. The recognition he had always desired for himself was now linked to her. Daniel closed the newspaper and ran a hand over his face, struggling to process the reality. He had never believed Sophia could shine on her own. He had always thought she depended on him, that without him, she wouldn't have the strength to go on. But now, seeing her name in the headlines, he realized just how blind he had been. While he had dismissed her, she had been growing into someone greater than he had ever imagined. Natalie noticed the change in Daniel even before he realized it. At first, she pretended not to care, but soon it became clear that he was no longer the man she had admired. He had become distracted, restless, always lost in his thoughts. She tried to draw him back with romantic dinners and exclusive parties, but nothing seemed to work. It didn't take long for her to figure out that Daniel wasn't losing interest in the parties or the status. He was obsessed with Sophia. That irritated her deeply. Natalie had never been with him for love, only for influence and prestige. But now he wasn't the powerful figure she had once sought to be around. He was broken, lost. With the same coldness she had always maintained, Natalie started to make new connections. She began to get closer to other businessmen, making her exit without any fanfare. By the time Daniel realized what had happened, she was already involved with an even more influential magnate. She didn't bother explaining herself. She simply moved on, without looking back. Daniel didn't react. He didn't go after her or question her. Deep down, he knew it had never been about love. What bothered him the most was that this time, he didn't feel anything but indifference. He had lost her, and for the first time, he understood that it was his own fault. He sat down on the sofa one evening, his thoughts spinning, and his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a message from Sophia. "Can we talk?" it read. He hesitated. For a moment he thought about calling her, telling her how much he regretted everything. But what could he say? How could he explain the hole that had formed in his chest? He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. He typed a reply, his fingers shaking. "I need to see you." The message was sent. He sat there, staring at his phone, waiting for a response that never came. Minutes passed. An hour. 2. There was no reply. No seen notification. No acknowledgement. Daniel felt a pang of despair in his chest. Sophia didn't want to talk to him anymore. That rejection stung more than anything he had ever experienced. He had always been in control of his business, his women, his reputation. But with Sophia, he realized he had lost it all. He had no power over her anymore, and for the first time, he understood the depth of that loss. Days passed, and the void left by Sophia's absence grew larger. All of Daniel's achievements, all of his wealth, all of his power seemed meaningless without her. He began to understand that, in the end, he had never really needed any of it. What he had truly needed was Sophia. One evening, Daniel found himself walking through the empty halls of his penthouse. The silence that once brought him comfort now felt suffocating. He had everything, but it all felt like nothing. He couldn't fill the emptiness with business deals, expensive dinners, or the company of other women. Nothing could replace Sophia. He sat down at the bar, poured himself another drink, and stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker below. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had it all. Instead, he felt small and insignificant, consumed by the weight of his own choices. He had everything, but he had lost the one thing that had truly mattered, and there was no going back. Daniel spent days agonizing over the decision to send another message to Sophia. The first one had been ignored, but he couldn't accept that as a definitive end. He needed to see her, needed to talk to her, at least to understand if there was any chance of recovering what he had lost. The idea that Sophia had moved on without looking back destroyed him. She couldn't have just erased him from her life as if he had never existed. He learned through an interview that she would be at a gala event in Madrid. It was an exclusive reception for leaders in the tech industry, with only special invited guests. In the past, Daniel would have had no difficulty entering such an event. But now, he was no longer the star of the night. Sophia was, and that made him realize just how far away he had become from her world. He managed to get an invitation through a contact, and that night he put on his best suit and headed to the event. He didn't know exactly what he would say, but he had to be there. He needed to see her up close, remember what her presence felt like, look for any sign of hesitation in her eyes, anything that would give him hope. But as he entered the ballroom, he was hit by a scene he hadn't expected. Sophia was stunning, surrounded by investors and business people, her posture confident, her gestures assured. But she wasn't alone. Samuel was at her side. Daniel's gaze locked onto that man who, even years ago, had shown respect and admiration for Sophia. And now, they seemed so natural together, as if they had always belonged in this world side by side. Daniel's chest tightened with anger and frustration. He had to interrupt this. He needed to show Sophia that she couldn't just replace him. He walked toward her without thinking twice, ignoring the looks around him. When he finally stood before her, Sophia looked up, and to his despair, there was no surprise in her eyes. Just absolute calm, as if seeing him there was irrelevant. "Can we talk?" he asked, keeping his voice low, trying to seem in control of the situation. Sophia held her champagne glass and smiled faintly, taking her time to respond. Samuel observed silently, but without any sign of concern. He knew Daniel no longer represented a threat. Finally, Sophia spoke. "About what?" Daniel felt a lump in his throat. She didn't even give him the courtesy of pretending this encounter was important. He took a deep breath and leaned in a little closer. "I've made mistakes. I see that now. I don't want things to end this way between us." Sophia raised an eyebrow slightly. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. She simply looked at him with a faint curiosity, as though she were facing a man who no longer meant anything. "Daniel, things aren't ending. They ended a long time ago. You just didn't realize it." The silence between them was cutting. Daniel hadn't expected her to welcome him with open arms, but hearing it so directly felt like a punch to the gut. He looked around, feeling as if the world had stopped spinning for a moment. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed calm, comfortable, untouchable. "I know you loved me," he insisted. "I know we had something real. You can't just pretend it didn't mean anything." She sighed, as if bored by a pointless conversation. "I don't pretend anything, Daniel. You're the one who always assumed I would be there forever. But what you're feeling now isn't love. It's the weight of what you've lost." He clenched his fists. Samuel remained by her side, without the need to intervene. Sophia had already won that battle without lifting a finger. Daniel realized that there was nothing he could say that would change the reality in front of him. She had moved on, and he was no longer a part of it. He took a deep breath, trying to hold on to what little dignity he had left. "So this is it?" Sophia took a sip of her champagne before replying, "Yes, Daniel, this is it." He hesitated for a moment, hoping she would change her mind, that her expression would soften, that something in her would give him a glimmer of hope. But there was nothing, only the certainty that his time in her life had run out. Daniel gave a final glance to Samuel, who remained unshaken, secure in his position beside Sophia. He realized there was no longer any room for him there. He felt a knot in his throat, but forced a brief smile. "Good luck, Sophia." She simply nodded. Daniel left the event and felt the cold night air hit his face. He had never imagined that one day he would feel the weight of such an absolute defeat. But in that moment, he knew there was nowhere else to run. Sophia was too far out of his reach. While he sank deeper into the certainty of his loss, Sophia continued her night without looking back. She kept talking with investors, closing deals and expanding her empire even further. Her life was full, light, exactly how she had always wanted it to be. The next morning, as Daniel stared at his reflection in the mirror, realizing the emptiness he carried, Sophia was boarding yet another international trip. With Samuel by her side and a brilliant career ahead, the past no longer mattered. She had won. He finally had given up.